Welcome again, colleagues. In accordance with Section 108 of the Rules of Procedure and the motion adopted on 21st of April 2026, we're meeting today to consider the draft regulations on the use of French in private businesses under federal jurisdiction. I would now like to welcome our witnesses. So, speaking in a personal capacity, we have Stéphanie Chouinard, Associate Professor. Welcome. And Stéphanie, I understand you have Roman with you. Is that right? Yes, and we're going to hope that it all goes well. My life is more chaotic than usual at the moment. So welcome to Roman, and know that sometimes as chair I think that it's more chaotic than we anticipate. So welcome. And from the Société de la Francophonie Manitobaine, we have Derek Bentley, who's President, and Jean-Michel Baudry, Executive Director, both appearing by video conference. Welcome to both of you. Each organization will have 5 minutes for an opening statement, and then we'll proceed to the questions from the committee members. Ms. Chouinard, if you're ready, you have the floor for 5 minutes. Well, thank you very much, Chair, Vice President, and honorable members of the committee. Thank you for having invited me to give evidence as part of this study. My remarks today will focus on the impact of the regulations on the Francophone community outside of Quebec, and more specifically, I'll focus on Part 2 of the regulations, namely the regions with a strong Francophone presence and on the obligations of businesses towards their customers in these regions. On the one hand, the draft regulation relies on data from the 2021 census to determine regions with a strong Francophone presence. I have some reservations about basing a rights regime on the results of a single census. Official language minority communities are dynamic, and they're often the ones that are most underestimated by censuses, particularly those with newcomers and multilingual households. The criteria chosen prioritize concentration over vitality, which will have consequences for the communities this law is supposed to protect. It's also a pity that the regulations did not draw on the mechanism for determining where there is significant demand, as set out in the regulations under Part 4 of the Official Languages Act. It stands to reason that if there's a significant demand for French languages services in a region, it's very likely because there's a strong Francophone presence. However, for much the same purpose, the regulation currently under consideration introduces a new definition of the regions where private businesses under federal jurisdiction will have language obligations, which creates a complex system where citizens may be unaware that they're in a region designated under the regulation, particularly when dealing with the list of census areas, as is the case with our friends in Manitoba. This is a geographic designation that is particularly obscure to the average person. Potentially, addressing the situation, Section 15 of the regulation requires businesses in question to clearly indicate to consumers in that region that they may communicate with the businesses in French and receive services from in that language. In my view, this wording is far too weak. We should require these businesses to make an active offer of services. I must say, moreover, I was surprised to find no mention anywhere in the regulation of active offer, a principle that is nevertheless well established. Many research studies and reports have been written on this principle. I won't mention them all, but they allow us to identify some best practices. First, the provision of services, whether in person, on the phone, in writing, online, or on social media, must always be provided in both languages from the very first point of contact and thereafter. Secondly, we must ensure that services are of equal quality in either language. The choice of language must not affect the quality of the service received, nor must it result in additional delays in obtaining service. Finally, the provision of services must make citizens feel comfortable in choosing the language of their choice. This means, among other things, that provision of services must be culturally appropriate. In short, the aim of active provision is to ensure that citizens have a genuine choice to use the language of their choice. Many studies have shown that in a minority context, if institutions are left to choose freely without active provision being imposed in the minority language alongside the majority language, the result is a social dynamic that favors the majority language. This is all the more true in the present case, where we're trying to change the status quo. We must ensure that users have no hesitation or embarrassment in requesting services in the official language of their choice. Finally, the draft regulation provides for the application of the law in Quebec to businesses with at least 25 employees. But outside Quebec, In regions with a strong Francophone presence, only to businesses with at least 100 employees within those regions or 500 employees nationwide. This asymmetry is significant. Small businesses under federal jurisdiction with which Francophones outside of Quebec most frequently interact could fall well below this threshold. A consumer in Northern Ontario or on the Acadian Peninsula might find that the businesses they use on a daily basis are entirely exempt. I invite the committee to examine carefully how this threshold was chosen and whether it's based on evidence or it's arbitrary. Thank you, and I look forward to continuing the discussion. Thank you very much, Madame Chouinard. And now I pass the floor to Mr. Bentley for 5 minutes. Thank you very much, Chair. And greetings to the members of the committee. Thank you for having invited us to appear before you today to share our perspective as a Francophone community in minority setting. My name is Derek Bentley. I'm president of the Société de la Francophonie Manitobaine, the SFM, the representative body for Manitoba's Francophone community. Our testimony is in support of the brief submitted by the Fédération des Communautés Francophonie Acadienne du Canada, the FCFA, and by the Fédération des Associations de Juristes d'Expression Française de Common Law, the FAJEF. Let's be clear, the idea of moving forward with this draft regulation under the Act respecting the use of French in private businesses under federal jurisdiction is very encouraging. We applaud this draft regulation. It's a major step forward. The UFA marks a decisive turning point in moving from a mere aspiration to an enforceable obligation and leading us towards true equality between our two official languages. Above all, this draft regulation will have a real and direct impact on French-speaking citizens of Manitoba who wish to live their lives in French every day within their communities. In Manitoba, we're fortunate to live in a very unique context. Generally speaking, we find that the designation criteria proposed in the draft regulation are consistent with our province's laws, regulations, and policies, which is unfortunately not the case everywhere, such as in Ontario. As the FCFA points out, we recognize the importance, as is indeed the case in the federal official languages regulation, of ensuring that designation criteria take into account historical and community factors, as well as provincial legislation. In addition to issues concerning the designation criteria, we must also take a broader view and ensure that there are no loopholes when situations become more complex. Let me explain. We know very well that in Manitoba, as the FAJEF highlights in its submission, that Francophone citizens living in the regions designated by the draft regulation face real challenges in accessing certain services. During significant and stressful events in their lives, be it transactions of property or commercial transactions or bankruptcy proceedings or inheritance matters or divorce, they struggle to receive end-to-end services in their preferred language. We have been informed of very specific examples where Francophones come up against a wall of difficulties in more complex cases involving banks or telecommunications companies. This is why we believe it's absolutely essential that the regulation specifies the obligation for these companies to conduct proceedings in French and to use French in the courts. And if we want this regulation to be good, it should not stay stuck in frozen in time. This is why we recommend a mandatory review of the regulation every 5 years to reflect the evolution of our communities. This brings me to a fundamental point. Revision must never mean a step backwards. This is why we support another key recommendation from the FCFA, the inclusion of the ratchet principle, or the principle of no backsliding. In practical terms, once French language services are provided by a company in a region, they must be maintained, even in the event of a decline in population. We cannot withdraw an acquired right on the pretext that the percentages are fluctuating. That would be accelerating assimilation rather than combating it in favor of genuine equality. Furthermore, for the UFA to have the intended impact, transparency is necessary. We wish to echo the recent comments of the Commissioner of Official Languages. A register of businesses subjected to the UFA must be created, and it must be accessible and public. Both the Commissioner of Official Languages of Canada and the French-speaking citizens of our province must be able to know clearly and unambiguously which businesses have the obligation to serve them in French. As such, if new rights are granted to citizens, we must ensure that they're respected. We therefore believe that it's crucial that the Office of Commissioner of Official Languages has access to the necessary resources, not only to handle complaints properly, but also to proactively ensure the rigorous enforcement of the regulations on the ground. In conclusion, a regulation is not merely a technical detail. It's an instrument that turns Parliament's will into reality for our communities. We have an opportunity to make a real difference in the lives of Francophones in Manitoba and across the country. Thank you very much for the opportunity to speak with you, and I'll be happy to answer your questions along with Jean-Michel. Thank you very much, Mr. Bentley. So we'll move to the questions from the MPs. I would like to welcome two colleagues who are here with us today. They don't normally sit on this committee. There is Elisabeth Prière and Tamara Kronis. Thank you very much for being here with us today. So I will pass the floor to Mr. Godin for 6 minutes. Thank you, Chair. First of all, I'd like to thank our witnesses and welcome Romane, a new witness today. Did everything very well, so I think you must be relieved, Madame Chouinard. So I will start by asking you questions. You have said that the regulation or that the team of officials worked only from a single source of data, the 2021 census. Could you guide us a little bit? What should we have used as additional data in order to be more efficient? The counterexample I presented on Part 4 of the regulation calculates where the demand is high. So we do it more on a case-to-case basis, where either percentage of the population is present or there's a threshold number. I'm sorry, I'm being kicked here. According to the various types of services and communications, there are different criteria. So either use a percentage or an absolute figure that's an objective, which means that if the situation is fluctuating on the ground, we can do something. So there's also the possibility that I didn't mention, but that we can look at the designated areas every 5 years, which the regulation asks for. But there's a possibility that we determine regions and we lose sight of the regions where there's a certain vitality, but the census doesn't allow us to know what's happening in the field. So in spite of the goodwill of StatsCan, and I know there were different questions that were added to the census to have a better idea of the communities of official languages in minority situations, we're still missing people who might be able to use this service in the field. Thank you, Ms. Chouinard. We heard witnesses tell us that we could maybe add to the process of defining regions with a strong potential of Francophone presence, the organizations that are in the field. Yes, there's data and there's a grid for calculating these figures, but is that something that could be useful? I'd like to know what you think. Are you talking about consultation of those organizations? Well, consult, but more than that, because, consultations, that's a very broad term, and I don't think we often consider the data that we gather when we do consultations. Could they be involved in the broader process so that we can better define small regions where there's a high concentration of Francophones, but that doesn't show up in the evaluation grid established by Heritage Canada? I think that to take into account the knowledge of people who are in the field, in the ground, or who are there, would lead us in the good direction. And according to the new Official Languages Act, the consultation process should involve better accountability, so we would be respecting that. I don't know whether there's a consistency with the two acts that we're discussing. So, Madame Chouinard, you didn't mention this in your statement, but I would like to know, what is your opinion? You said that you were going to make a presentation on the use of French by businesses outside of Quebec, but I'd like to hear what you have to say about Quebec, because there was a proposal in Quebec when we studied the bill that we could isolate Quebec, which has a particular status in North America, which is the only province where the common language is French, to subject it to the charter of the French language. And then at the very, very last minute, something was negotiated, and Minister Roberge in Quebec ceded to the pressure by the Liberal government at the time, and gave the organizations in Quebec the possibility of choosing. Isn't that a loophole? Because we're choosing what's the most restrictive, the most normative. So didn't that have a big effect in Quebec? We'll have to see how that plays out in the field, but we can expect that the businesses choose the least restrictive regime. And in the Quebec context, it creates an inconsistency, kind of chaos. We're the only province where we have the choice of one regime or the other. Do you think that we shouldn't give the mandate, or that Heritage Canada gives a mandate to the federally regulated business in Quebec, that they are the ones who have that mandate to manage it? Because in the Act, there's no rigorous obligation for consequences for the businesses if they don't comply. I think that the Office de la Langue Française is better equipped to do that. So should we not look at this possibility in the transition? So I would like to interrupt you. There are 10 seconds left. So could you give us a brief answer? So it's an interesting issue. I have no clear answers because I didn't have time to think about it.
Even shorter than I expected. Thank you. Mr. Deschanteriaux, 6 minutes. Thank you, Chair. I'll start with Ms. Chinois from Manitoba. Ms. Chinois, you mentioned the concept of active offer, which is now active from the regulations. If I understand you well, you are saying that this should be clearly, explicitly mentioned. Now, how will that be defined? Could you give us different criteria that will help us define what active offer could be? But what would be your concrete proposal? How could we amend the regulation to add that instead of Section 15 of the regulations, where we talk about clearly indicating this to consumers, I would say we should explicitly state the mandate given to the businesses to provide an active offer, and that there should be a list of items which require an active offer, whether it's in person, on things that are posted, written communications over the phone, on the internet. In Ontario, at the time of François Boileau, in 2016, there was an article clearly explaining characteristics and the best practices for an active offer. It's 10 years old, but I think these are best practices that you can consult. So please, you can consult that document. Thank you. It's part of the work I did before I became an MP. Now, you are asking us to define the concept, but you also want us to be clear by what we mean. Yes, indeed. But the Federal Public Service is already aware of an active offer, and the Official Languages Commissioner also prepared a special report on an active offer. Knowledge on this, on the active offer, when it's well done, already exists in the Federal Public Service. Now, there are also regions that are defined. The Francophone population is defined as per areas of concentration. There's also the variable. We're not talking about defining the population by identity, but we want to be able to estimate the number of people who may require a certain language, if they're the minority population. This would be a step in the right direction. What I would propose is that we review the regulations under Part 4 and to see how a strong demand is expressed, because it's not only about certain regions, but there's the criteria of percentage as well and the numeric criteria, and we could make adjustments as there are changes on the ground. So we'll not necessarily need to review the list every 5 years. As may be the case. And the proposal we received from the Commissioner when it comes about the register of businesses that are federally regulated, what do you think about the proposal? That will definitely help Canadians to clearly understand at what service point exactly are the businesses they could receive the services or when they could expect French language service. Now, let's turn to Manitoba. If I understand you, in its current form, the regulation clearly reflects regions with a strong Francophone presence. As it is currently written, it reflects the realities of the Francophones in Manitoba, in the sense that we are the province where the Manitoban legislative framework in the province looks a lot like the zones that were designated by the draft regulation. But there are some 10 regions that were not defined, that may be defined as a bilingual region, but the designation is not complete. There are regions like Elichi, regions with strong Francophone presence that were recognized by the province, but in the draft regulation, they are not considered designated regions. Now, looking at the recommendation, the 5-year recommendation, we had different perspectives, particularly on the fact that after 5 years, the fear is that issues may have been implemented but will not have had enough time to assess the impact considering the challenges. We understand that we have the numbers to take into account, but some comments were made during testimonies to say that maybe 5 years was too quick, so we may allow more time for implementation. What do you think about that? You have about 50 seconds. If we see the current regulation as a flaw and the idea is really to amend the regulation and the criteria to include a greater proportion of the Francophones in Canada in minority regions. Every 5 years, yes, there may be challenges, but I think it's better to do so every 5 years than wait 10 years. This could have an impact in the development of official language minority communities. 15 seconds left. Ms. Chinois, you can come back later, but we heard that the regulation should apply in all provinces and territories. Do you think this is realistic? Could you repeat the question? There was a proposal that the regulation should apply in all provinces and territories. Do you think this is a realistic proposal? I'm not sure. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Deschamps-Thériault. I now give the floor to Mr. Beaulieu. You have 6 minutes, sir. Thank you, Chair. Good afternoon, Ms. Chinois. Do you consider that the UFPBA improves the right to work in French or receive services in French in Quebec, or is this a parallel system to what already operates in Quebec? I think that this will have an impact. Now, as to what the impact will be, particularly in the different regions in Quebec, well, I don't think that there are areas where working or offering French language services is a problem. But everywhere else, the message being sent in the rest of the country, including Quebec, is a good one. And this will have a certain impact, even though the impact will be less drastic than in other parts of the country. Because already there's an entire Francization process with the French language charter and so on. And there are more resources. Now, looking at the official languages, do you think that we could assess the resources that we will need? It takes a lot of resources to guide businesses to follow up the process. Do you think the commissioner without resources may be able to do so. Certainly, the official language commissioner will need more resources to implement this part of his new mandate. And it goes along with his new mandate. For example, the financial fines are included. Clearly, the office needs more resources. There's something that I found strange on the register of federally regulated businesses. There seems to be some confusion. A while ago, we read that 90% of federally regulated businesses were subject to Bill 101. Elsewhere, I saw that it was 60%. We're talking about 400 or so businesses. If you take into account businesses with less than 100 employees or less, is there no register for federally regulated businesses? That's special. I think it's important for that register to be published. The minister was talking about negotiating with the minister from Quebec. Here as well, we saw WestJet saying that they were going to be exempt from application of Bill 101, and they wanted a regime that would apply throughout the country. What do you think? I hope not. I hope that we will not be exempting some businesses that operate in Quebec and elsewhere in the country. But listen, I do not have a crystal ball. I do not know what will happen. Let's wait and see. Maybe a question from the man from Manitoba, the gentleman from Manitoba. We don't have lots of regions now that will be subject to the law. Do you agree that it's not only businesses with 100 employees and more that should be targeted? Could we target regions with a strong Francophone presence? You talked about taking into account the historic context. Could you please give us more information about that? I think this comes back to what Stéphanie Chinois also mentioned during her testimony. There are other indicators that were identified in the Official Languages Regulations, Part 4, the presence of schools and other Francophone institutions in the region. And this is what testifies to the vitality of Francophonie in the region. And that should be part of the calculation. In Manitoba, as I said, the current calculation takes into account Francophone communities, but there are many other communities that are considered vibrant communities, vibrant Francophone communities, the Saint-Pierre, the Salaberry, where we have a strong Francophone presence, and we would want these communities to be served as well. 1 minute left. In the new Official Languages Act, we talk about a right of remedy. I know that there are some laws that prohibit the learning of French. So I think it's important to take into account all that and to broaden application of the law. Now, a question for Ms. Chinois. You talked about some businesses. Do you agree that it should apply to businesses with less than 100 employees outside Quebec? Preferably so. What I thought about when I read the draft regulations is how did we arrive at that determination? We have two standards. We have regions with a strong Francophone presence. where we may have some bad surprises. Have we thought about the impact on the ground when we did the calculations? Did we arrive at the figure of 100 employees or less or more because administratively speaking, it was easier to manage? So those are the ideas I thought about. I'm sorry I have to interrupt you, Mr. Bolio. Your time is up. Second round of questions. Mr. Dalton, you have 5 minutes. Thank you very much. Thank you, witnesses, for being here. Ms. Chinois, it's always a pleasure to have you here. I remember the very first time we had you here in the committee. It was during COVID. You have very clear recommendations and proposals, and which are much appreciated. We appreciate your presence here, as well as the Federation from Manitoba. Ms. Chinois, if you were to have a magic wand which you could use everywhere in Canada, and I'm talking particularly outside Quebec, I am an MP from British Columbia, which region will you add to be covered by these regulations? The west of Labrador will be great. That's where I grew up. When we look at the list of regions, Newfoundland and Labrador, Saskatchewan are not listed, and BC. If we want to have a region in every province with a certain designation, I think this will help official language minority communities in those regions. We don't want them to be ignored by the regulation. Once again, what we find in Part 4 of the regulations will help. The interpreter would like to point out that there are sound issues with the speaker. Interpretation will resume.
Mais ça vient pas avec un doctorat en sciences politiques, une baguette magique, malheureusement.
Oui, mais ça c'est qu'est-ce qu'on a entendu des autres provinces aussi.
And we heard about the other provinces. We also had witnesses from Nova Scotia, and I had some correspondence with BC. So they don't see how these regulations, how this act will help them. So they're a bit discouraged about that. You said that the fact that it's a bit arbitrary and they're emphasizing concentration more than vitality. Could you speak about that in greater detail? So again, it's the determination that was made with using the data that existed in 2021. So that is a structural weakness. I think we could do better in order to determine what regions have a strong presence. Your colleague, Mr. Deschanteriaux, had talked about the various data that is being collected by Statistics Canada. There's the counterexample of the regulation on Part 4, where I admit that it's a bit more complex, but it reflects more efficiently regions where there's a strong concentration of francophones in minority settings. And Mr. Bentley, you have said that you thought that there will be a real impact, a significant impact of these regulations. Can you tell us more about that? Are there major weaknesses now? You said that the province was very sensitive to the Francophone minorities in Manitoba. Yes, we're lucky because we have communities that were designated, and so it's very easy to say, oh, we're lucky. because we know that there are provinces where there are no designated areas, but we hear challenges that exist in the field. And so this regulation has a possibility of ensuring that the people in the majority of our regions with a strong presence have the capacity of receiving services. So that human experience is really important, where we ensure that a Franco-Manitoban can have access to services from the local businesses that will help them. So we are lucky because we do have designated areas, and we acknowledge that it's not the case everywhere in Canada with the current regulation. Thank you, Mr. Dalton. And now I would give the floor to Ms. Minga Ali for 5 minutes. Thank you, Chair. Thank you to all witnesses who are here today. So I'll start my questions for you, Madame Chouinard. In your analysis, what are the major challenges associated to the obligation of an active offer in private businesses under federal jurisdiction? That would probably be to find a sufficient number of employees to ensure that they're able to respect what an active offer is. So, particularly, the obligation when that active offer is implemented, that from the very first contact, the service is offered in the language of their choice, and that there be no additional delays when we're asking to be served in that language. So that will be the major challenge in the field. And how do you define an active offer that is significant for consumers and realistic for businesses? That depends on the size of the business and on the number of employees that are on the front lines. So that's a question for somebody who's a human resources expert. Oh, I'm really sorry. But, I'm sorry. I think I'm going to turn off my mic. I'll continue my questions with you, Mr. Bentley. Thank you, Madame Chouinard. I will maybe come back to my questions for you. Maybe. So, Mr. Bentley, how can the UFPBA reinforce the vitality of the Franco-Manitoban community outside of work? I'll ask Jean-Michel to answer this time. I think that it really creates an environment where people, as Mr. Bentley said earlier, where people can choose to live in French. So we could choose to live next to our Francophone school. We can go accede to government services in French, and same thing with private businesses. We'll continue to get our services in French. And also, it favors access to employment for Francophones in those areas of strong Francophone presence. And that has a structural effect. And in Manitoba, the other thing is that it accepts the project we have of making our province truly bilingual, which is what the provincial government wants to do. And that's not the case at all in Ontario, to acknowledge the provincial legislative framework in terms of the designated regions. So that would be very, very positive. Thank you. And the linguistic reality of Manitoba is different from that in Quebec and even from that of Ontario. How should that reality influence the implementation of the Act? As I said earlier, I think to really acknowledge the provincial unique characteristics. So, as Madame Chouinard said, so the identified communities having that has a strong Francophone presence, really to base yourself on these realities that are unique to each province and territory throughout the country. So, as Mr. Bentley said earlier, for us, we can see that there is a concentration in the current criteria in the areas where there are Francophone schools, where there are Francophone cultural centers, where there's already existing vitality. And as Madame Chouinard said several times, that are defined in the Part 4 of the regulation. So all these systems could really rely on each other. That would be an optimal system. 35 seconds. So the criteria used to define regions with a strong Francophone presence, do they adequately reflect the Manitoba realities? You have 20 seconds. Yes, and I think there are still many regions that have been left out. And that's why we should really go and look what can be done in terms of Part 4 of the regulation. There are other criteria beyond percentage that is used in that Part 4, and that's really the path that we would choose. So now, Mr. Beaulieu, you have 2.5 minutes. Thank you. In terms of Manitoba, I'm wondering why the government decided that it would be 25 employees and more in Quebec, as in the French language charter, but elsewhere in Canada, it's 100 employees or more. According to you, in Manitoba, would it be realistic to apply the UFPBA to businesses with 25 employees or more? Would there be a sufficient number of Francophone employees? So to have consistency, as Madame Chouinard said, we need to have a criterion that's the same throughout the country. That would be reasonable. Are there challenges in terms of hiring staff in certain regions? So the criterion would be reasonable for 100 employees or for 25. It's difficult to say, but it would change the list of businesses that are subject to it. We don't have enough information to have a strongly held opinion about this, but to have the same standard everywhere would be good if we base ourselves then on what was done in Quebec. And there could be other differences between Quebec and outside of Quebec, is that in Quebec, it wasn't in the Act, but it's in the regulation, the businesses have to, in their signage, in their communications, French must be predominant. But I haven't seen anything about signage for businesses outside of Quebec. I don't know, Madame Chouinard or our Manitoba witnesses, what do you think of that? Well, I can follow in the same vein as Madame Chouinard. The principle of the active offer means the issue of signage would be integrated in that principle of active offer in terms of signage. If there were notions of active offer in the UFPBA, the issue of signage would come into it. Well, Mr. Beaulieu, there's Article 15, Section 15, where they ask the businesses to indicate clearly to consumers that can communicate in French and receive services, but there's not more that's said. To my mind, that is too weak, too permissive, and doesn't encourage businesses to go further with the proven concept, which is that of active offer, which we already know about, and which would mean that we're not. It would not just be appearances; it would be a service that really existed, and there wouldn't be any cost to the consumer. Mr. Beaulieu, you've run out of time. I'm sorry. And now I pass the floor to Mr. Bélanger. Oh, Madame Cronus for 5 minutes. Thank you to all the witnesses for their evidence today. Ms. Chouinard, Nanaimo is not on the list, but the Francophone community is really growing in my riding of Nanaimo. And there's a welcoming Francophone community, which is designated by Immigration and Refugee Board, and also Citizenship Canada, IRCC, that's it. The city offers federal support that's adapted to the Francophone newcomers to help them settle, to find jobs, and to be integrated in the region in terms of the social and cultural aspects. We know that we want the new Francophone newcomers to feel welcome and supported. And that's one of the reasons why I'm learning French. At the same time, Nanaimo remains strongly or majority Anglophone region. Many businesses under federal jurisdiction already have challenges in terms of staff and the rules that they must follow. How can these regulations help the Francophone communities that are growing, such as that in Nanaimo, without creating regulations that are too heavy for businesses that are primarily serving an Anglophone clientele? Thank you, Ms. Cromas. Yes, Nanaimo, as a welcoming community, made a lot of people jealous because BC was the first province to get a second designation of a welcoming community in the country, if I'm not mistaken. So I think that's one of the questions that was in the mind of those who drafted the regulation. How can we support the Francophone communities without creating undue or insurmountable pressures for businesses, especially in regions where the communities are vital, dynamic, but not necessarily very large? So I don't have a clear answer to your question, but I am convinced that the regulation in its current state can be slightly modified to really take into account regions where there's demand without creating conditions that are difficult or impossible for businesses. Thank you. I'll give my colleague from Sudbury, Eston Manitoulin. Thank you very much. My colleague asked a question that's very relevant for the future, I believe.
C'est peut-être une question.
I may be asking Manitoba to answer that question as well, because they may have experienced this before. The criteria to determine the regions with a strong Francophone presence, maybe they are not necessarily all the best. At the beginning, we said that maybe Francophone associations are best positioned to give the determination. Regions that may become strong may have a strong Francophone presence in the future. There's a lack of consistency that exists. Part 4 of the regulations and of the UFPBA. In Manitoba, only part of the 2 regions were designated by the draft regulation. So yes, communities are best positioned to talk about the vitality of their communities. The presence of schools and other institutions are a factor that could be added to the draft regulations and which will help improve the consistency of Part 4 with these regulations, knowing that when we look at this ratchet principle, we would add designated regions every time we review the regulation. So I think that it's important to add this principle directly into the UFPBA, and we should clearly state designated zones instead of doing a review every 5 years when we have a new census. Thank you. Thank you, Ms. Kronos. I'll give the floor now to Ms. Chenet for 5 minutes. Thank you to all our witnesses. Special shout out to you, Ms. Chinois. You are multitasking very well. Your responses are very relevant. Congratulations. What I'm hearing from your responses is that there's a problem, an issue, having more territory and being clearer on what has been drafted, clearly indicating an active offer. And thirdly, we need to find out whether the businesses will have the capacity to deliver. So my question goes to Manitoba, because you have an association that has experience and could be useful to the rest of Canada. If we want to make sure that we are making progress, will it be better to have transition years? What do I mean? We say in Quebec they have 2 years to allow others to prepare during those 2 years. Take the example of 25 employees versus 100 employees. What I understand is that there's a problem having necessary resources. So in terms of preparation, can we give 2 additional years to allow those with 25 employees to get to 100 employees, and we give them time to develop bilingualism in the regions? Is this something that we can explore, or does it complicate matters? I don't think it complicates the situation. Another example that is not a regulation. Take Francophone immigration targets in minority regions. We set progressive targets, and then we try to attain those targets. If we have this principle in the draft regulation for UFPBA, and then we try to move towards offering more services in official language minority groups, I think this could be a positive step. So the non-regression principle or the ratchet principle would be essential. In Part 4 of the regulation, there's a circular that is part of it, that is included. It's not because there's a slight drop in percentage in a region that it will be automatically withdrawn from the list of designated regions. So that's important. Now, talking about active offer, Mr. Bentley said this, but let me add, there's the issue of A to Z services. Usually the first contact at the reception could be in French, but when it becomes more complicated, for example, starting a bankruptcy process, or if the business is a telecommunications business or a bank, right now they don't have the reflex to engage in the entire process in French. So I think this should be clearly stated in the draft regulations. The businesses should offer French language at the reception, but sometimes they should have the obligation to offer other services as well in French. Thank you. Now, to help implement these regulations, considering that businesses outside Quebec may have 2 years to prepare, what could we do to help businesses to prepare and to have the necessary resources? Can they use learning technologies? How can we create real momentum to make sure that there's real bilingualism instead of complaining about constraints if they feel that it's a challenge for them to work with French? Once again, we don't have the comprehensive list of businesses that are targeted. For national businesses, if I understand well, there are many of those businesses that will be captured or concerned. There are Francophone businesses elsewhere in the country. I think there's a way of ensuring that the services are offered in designated regions in French from one region to another. It doesn't necessarily cover the right to work in French in those regions, but I think that could be done over time. Initially, we could talk about offering services in French in a designated zone, and things would evolve naturally. And with time, resources may be brought into those regions to offer services in French. I'm done. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Ms. Chenette. On behalf of the committee, I would like to thank our witness, Mr. Bentley, Mr. Baudry, Ms. Chinois, Roman. Thank you all very much. Let me repeat Ms. Chenette's feelings. Ms. Chinois, your multitasking was impressive. I thought I used to multitask, but I think you took it to another level. Thank you very much for being here with us. Thank you for your work. Meeting is adjourned, colleagues. Thank you.